So the title was, as presented, A New Cold War question mark. I'm saying, in effect, the new Cold War. We're in this Cold War already. It's been launched by the US and their allies in the what I would call the imperialist bloc. And they have started a Cold War against a series of what they consider an axis of adversaries, as it was put by Rishi Sunak in the Parliament today, that and in the US as well, that the US and the allies of democracy faces an axis of adversaries of autocratic governments and states: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And this is what the battle is about. It's a war, at least cold for most part at the moment. But I want to start why there is this start of war. And I'm starting with the real cause of the process of a struggle between US and its allies and these other states is around the fact that imperialism, an imperialist bloc, exists, led by the United States, and has existed for a long time. And they see themselves as carving up the world for the profit of their big multinationals and banks. But they're finding it much, much more difficult to achieve further growth in profitability around the world. And at home in particular, as you can see on this graph, which just gives a quick summary of the rate of profit on capital for the top 20 countries in the world, and you can see that it's at quite low levels. So it's increasingly more difficult for capital, particularly imperialist capital, to expand its profitability in the last period. And also their ability to grow output and trade in order to increase production, profitability is declining as well. Global trade to GDP has now stagnated. That's a ratio between the amount of trade compared to the amount of output in the world. As you can see, the whole period from the 1970s, particularly from the 1980s, was a period of so-called globalization, where all the big multinationals in the advanced capitalist countries spread their industries, took their manufacturing to the so-called global south, in particular to China, to other places around the world in Asia and in Latin America, and increased trade levels dramatically, and therefore their profits. But that's come to an end. Since the Great Recession of 2008-9, we're in a depressed period, both for output amongst the major economies and also for trade to GDP. It's the end of globalization. And when that happens, when there's a more difficulty for capitalism to develop profitability at home and increase it through trade, that intensifies the competition between all capitalist countries on a world market and leads to the serious danger of destructive struggle amongst capitalist states. This is a quote by Enric Grossman, who first raised that idea in many ways in his work in the 1920s, when looking back at the development of imperialist powers that led to the First World War. And so whereas capitalist powers may be brothers in arms against labor in the struggle to increase profits, they also can easily become hostile brothers in competition with each other to the point of war in order to gain and control their market share. And as I say, the situation is worsening now for capital on a world scale. Growth in the major economies, according to the IMF only this week, said that the 5-year growth rate looking towards the end of this decade is slowing fast, and that by the end of the decade, the world and the major economies are growing at under 3% a year. And that includes all the countries of the world, like China and India and so on, which have much bigger growth rates. It means that the major imperialist powers in Europe, in North America, Japan, and so on, will be growing at less than 2%, even less than 1% growth rate. That's a really, really low level, which makes it virtually impossible for them to continue to build up profits unless they take on other countries in the world and take their part and control of output and trade. And also, historically, we've known that when capitalism gets into a severe slump, often its solution is to look at the government taking over from the private sector, and more importantly, even to the point of launching war in order to provide the opportunity to boost profitability across the board. Here's a measure quickly on the left there, you see, that's the US corporate rate of profit in 1929 to 45. you can see in 1929, just under 15%. By 1938, it had not recovered. What made the difference was the US entering the war and the Second World War, which dramatically improved the ability of the private sector to make profits out of the struggle which took place across the world at that time. But the human cost of war is huge. Here's a measure by Brown University. It points out the US military has engaged in counter-terrorism activities in 76 countries. That's nearly 40% of the world's nations. And it's expanded its operations mainly through violating human rights and civil liberties, both in the US and abroad. And something like maybe 1 million people have died in wars that the United States has carried out in this 21st century already. And so war not only becomes something which imperialism considers as a way out of their problems, but it also means the decimation of large sections of the human population if it takes off. But who are these imperialist powers which are creating this situation for the potential for both a cold or hot war? Well, here's a quick measure of wealth per person for different countries. And if you look on the working down from left to right, you can see basically is what I might call the usual suspects. We've got smaller imperialist powers or within the imperialist bloc like Norway and so on, but the key ones, the red ones, are the G7. You can see that they have the wealth per capita, which is much, much greater than the rest of the major economies around the world. If you just look at wealth per capita on the countries which they consider their enemies, China, Russia, or the other BRICS countries, the major emerging economies, they've really got quite a low level of per capita of wealth in the world compared to the G7 bloc. There's a clear distinction between the imperialist powers and the rest of the world. In fact, if we look at the sort of income which imperialist countries are getting into their economies from their investments abroad and the extraction of those profits, interest of rent back into their own countries, this is a measure of that per person, that Sweden, UK, US, getting something like $3,000 per person every year from their incomes of their investments abroad and their activities conducted abroad. And that's way, way more than any of the other big populated countries in the world. If we go down towards the right, you can see that countries like Russia, China, South Africa, the Philippines, big populated countries, Turkey, Brazil, virtually no income are they making from their foreign investments abroad. In other words, they don't really play a role. They are the victims of imperialism rather than being part of the imperialist bloc. This is a measure produced by another Marxist economist, and he shows that if we add together the different parts of what might define the power rankings in the world, we can take the GDP size, we can take the foreign assets held by a country, that's the yellow, we can take the amount of banks influence they've got around the world, that's the white, we can take the whether their currency is used by other countries to carry out transactions, that's the green, and then the top one is the red, military power, the size of their armies and how much spending is taking place. And you can see on this measure, the US is by far the most hegemonic power in the world. And even though China is second, if you take off the military and if you take off foreign assets, basically you can see that really the only reason China is second is because it has a large GDP. It doesn't really have much in addition to its GDP compared to the US, which has the largest GDP still, but all the other factors in this power ranking are way, way bigger. And the rest of the world is, apart from the smaller development for the imperialist powers like UK, France, Japan, Germany, and so on, if we go across the spectrum again, really they play no role in the power rankings of the world. But this is the change that's taking place. The US's hegemonic position is beginning to decline, at least relatively. If we just look at GDP, the share of global GDP back in the 1970s, the US and the first world, if you like, the other imperialist powers had 62% of GDP, while China had 2%. And even Russia at that time in 1970s only had 13%. Now, as we go 2020s into this decade, then the first world share has dropped to 44%. Russia's has dropped even more, but China's has jumped to 22%. India's picked up a little bit, and the so-called third world, or the other countries outside the imperialist bloc, have maintained their 20% position. So there's been a big shift in the share of global GDP, primarily from the imperialist powers' share to China's share, and to some extent India's share. And the dollar, being the currency of the world for decades, certainly since the 1950s, has begun to lose its shine. Its value relative to other currencies, round about in the 1970s, when it was taken off the gold standard, was, we've marked it here at 100. You can see now it's something like 80, 85. It's dropped nearly 20% in its value against other currencies. Very slowly, but it is declining as the major currency in the world. And although it's still the dominant currency, it is losing that overall strength that it's had back in the 1970s in the post-war period. And we now see that the so-called BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. BRICS, of course, has now increased to 10 states, but I think we're still working with these 5 states. Their share of world GDP has for the first time passed the share of world GDP held by the G7, the top 7 capitalist economies, which constitute the bulk of the imperialist bloc. So we can see again a relative big change between the imperialist bloc's strength in the past and now the strength of countries that are not in the imperialist bloc, and therefore threaten the position of imperialism over the next period. But we have to remember that there is still a big gap when we look at GDP per person between the imperialist powers and the BRICS. The G7 here, you can see per person, GDP per capita is over $50,000 per person in every of the G7 economies, and even higher in some. While the BRICS, the 5 BRICS, the best they can manage is $30,000. And even China, which is a big GDP economy, is per person, its economy is not anywhere near as big relative to the wealth or income that the average is in the United States. It's less than, more than about 20%. So there is still a huge gap between the economic power of the G7, the imperialist powers, and those that resist their hegemony on a global scale. Nevertheless, we can see certain things within BRICS, and I think this is worth reminding ourselves. If we look, this is looking at the 4 of the BRICS economies, and you'll notice, I think, that Brazil, for example, which is the dark blue line, has improved its per capita GDP as a ratio to the G7's per capita GDP a little bit. It was about 15% back in the 1980s. Now it's around 20%. If you like the light blue line, South Africa is deteriorating. Its position, say about 15% of the 1980s, has not got any better and worse on the whole. We've seen a steady rise in India's ratio to G7 per capita GDP, but it's tiny. It's way behind. The big red line is what worries imperialism. The huge rise in per capita GDP for China from around about 5% compared to G7 per capita GDP in just the start of this century to now well over 20%. So this is the big struggle which is now taking place, not only economically, but if we can briefly deal with politically and militarily down the road, that is between the United States as the leader of the imperialist bloc and China as the main opposition to the US's control of the world. The US may still be the world's sole military superpower, as it spends more on its military than the next 10 spending countries combined, and that includes China. But it is China that's the world's sole manufacturing superpower. Its production exceeds the next 9 manufacturing economies in the world. And you can see that the gross production, that's not GDP, that's everything that's produced, including all the bits and pieces of widgets and components in the world, China now produces 35% of all the physical things that we produce in the world, compared to the US is just 12% in manufacturing. And if you want to just look at the increase in GDP over the period, then China is now producing 30% of the increase of added value every year, compared to the US's 16%. It is the key manufacturing economy in the world. And again, if we can see that the G7 shares in this have gradually declined, these are the various G7 economies going downwards as their share, because it's being replaced by the huge rise in China's share of gross production. Similarly, China's share of manufacturing production is now is now larger than the next 10 economies apart from China. And we see the same process taking place in the key technology areas for the first time. If we go back to the period of the beginning of this century, we can see that China's position as a share of the total amount of semiconductor chips and other technology key components to the electronic and hi-fi and AI technology that's coming forward was very, very low. The US is nearly 50%, Europe's was nearly 30% of all chips, semiconductor chips. Now, look at the position as far as we can take it up to present times. It is the rate of the Chinese share now is nearly 20% of all semiconductors. The US has dropped to 40%. Europe has declined sharply to under China's. And the growth rate that China has got on semiconductor production of the new chips and so on is something like 30% a year now, and it's dramatically catching up with the rest of the world, particularly the imperialist powers. This is, again, a big threat to the future of profitability for US imperialism and its allies. So far, though, this has taken the form of trying to deal with this threat through a Cold War, although it's not entirely cold anymore. Already we have proxy wars in Ukraine, started in 2022 and unfinished. We have the war in Gaza by Israel, which is the main ally of the US in the Middle East, and the main combatant against the US's enemy in the Middle East, Iran, which is taking place in Gaza. And I've added Taiwan because there's continued skirmishes taking place between various forces, and Chinese forces and various other forces in the region who are allies of the US, skirmishes and so on, just the start. But it is still a Cold War on the whole. And what we've seen is the attempt of the Western alliances to crush economically China. That's their primarily aim. They started with economic sanctions against Chinese industries and Chinese officials and individuals. This is the new weapon, the economic weapon of modern war, which was replaced military war, at least up to now, and the basis of the Cold War. And these sanctions have taken the form, for example, Trump started banning services of Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant, and then 2 years later barred the entrance of various Chinese officials and prohibited all US companies from investing or purchasing from Chinese companies. And in 2022, after the Ukraine invasions, they sanctioned Chinese businesses for helping Russian military. And Biden has announced a series of measures of sales, limits on sales of semiconductors to China. That's just sanctions, but there are also tariffs. Here is the indication of how sharply the change in the trade war is taking place. Back in beginning of 2018, there were virtually no tariffs on Chinese imports, or US imports from China, Chinese exports into the US. Now that has dramatically changed. 60% of Chinese exports now are subject to US tariffs. Chinese have had to retaliate in the same way, and they have broadly the same amount of US exports being subject to Chinese tariffs. But of course, this is much more damaging in many ways for the US economy because they've depended so much on the cheap Chinese imports in manufacturing and electronics and other areas. And now US consumers are paying much more for those goods if they can get them at all, or they have to go elsewhere where they're more expensive. This process of tariff increases is going to continue. Trump wins the election in November, he plans an immediate 10% further increase on tariffs. And I'm sure that's not necessarily just exclusive to him, that Biden may well do something similar. And there are further threats being made by the US government towards China's economy and its exports very recently, with the visit of Janet Yellen to China, saying that China has got to stop exporting and producing because it's unfairly competing with European and US exports and companies. A ludicrous demand, but nevertheless, that's an indication of the way we're going. Question I'm going to ask in the brief time left to me, just for us to discuss, is can the US defeat China? Can it do this? Can it crush China's economic power? Can it weaken it? Can it bring about regime change over time by weakening its economy, short of a military intervention? Remember that the Soviet Union crumbled under the weight of the arms race, its isolation from the world economy in manufacturing, finance, and in key technology, and also because it was bureaucratically inert because of the weight of the Soviet bureaucracy on top of the economy and the working people there. And also, Soviets were maintaining a whole series of nations along the Eastern Europe, which they really didn't have much political support from. And so that was a big factor which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and in 1990. Can the US achieve the same thing with China? Well, I don't think it can, not immediately and not for some time away ahead, if at all. And that is because, first of all, China doesn't have an empire. It is on its own. It's an homogeneous force. It's a much more powerful economy, much more well-diversified, much greater strength in the world economy than existed for the Soviet Union. And it has built that position up under the noses of the Americans over the last 3 to 4 decades. So there's a lot of talk amongst Western economists and media that China is on the brink of collapsing. That talk has been going on now for 2.5 decades, and yet it still hasn't happened. It's going to be a financial collapse. It's going to be a real estate collapse. They're not going to be able to grow. They will fall behind. India will overtake them. China doesn't stand a chance. All these talk is going on, but this is wishful thinking, in my view, if we look at the process of the Chinese economy over the last 2 decades. Even since the Great Recession, yes, growth has slowed a little from the 8 to 10% a year to 5 or 6%, but that's still 2 or 3 times faster than anything enabled to be achieved by the G7 economies. So can it compete financially and militarily? Well, it can certainly compete, I think, financially. These are the 2 areas that the US is dominant in: the banks, the financial institutions around the world, the currency, and so on. China is beginning to break away from the US dollar. It's beginning to develop its own financial institutions and resources and develop them within the BRICS and the wider BRICS area, and that we'll see more of that. We've seen the massive expansion of their investments abroad through the Belt and Road Initiative to build infrastructure and other projects for so-called global South economies. And militarily, well, they're second in the world. They probably can't compete with the US across the world, but they can develop sufficient military strength to perhaps defend their country in an extreme way. And if we're talking about 1.4 billion people, way, way larger than even the combined forces of the G7 if they were to launch any sort of military action against China. Does the Chinese CP have popular support? Well, my view is that China doesn't have any sort of democratic accountability. The CP is not under the control of working people and their organizations. But that doesn't mean to say it doesn't have popular support. It still maintains, all public opinion polls show that the government at least still contains probably a majority support in amongst the Chinese people for the success of the economy and the ability to develop it dramatically over the last 30 or 40 years. That may change in the future. But when you put all those factors together, you can see that it's, in my view, a different situation from what existed in the Soviet Union in the 1980s as when that came to an end. Let me just add a word of warning that if China cannot be crushed economically, then the real danger is, if imperialism is still in trouble economically as well, and they can't change that we could move to a dangerous situation where we have a war of some military action between China and the US. Back in the late 1880s, Engels forecasted, said, look, the leading industrial powers are becoming so competitive. The struggle for profits and control of world markets is rising to the point where it's possible to consider for world war where millions of people die. And of course, he was proved right, unfortunately, some 25 years or so later. And that's a possibility over the next 25 years that will face us around the world unless it change in the direction of political and economic events as we see them now. The IMF chief, Kristalina Georgieva, said that we're now in a shock-prone world. And the solution to this, she said, in the 21st century was to develop the strength of the collective to deal with the shocks to come. What she meant by the collective was the collective will of the imperialist powers who pay her wages, the G7 countries. They have collectively come together, but they're not collective with a fair degree of unity at the moment, not in order to bring about peace around the world and end these shocks, but actually to raise the dangers of further wars and conflict with the enemies as they see them. Rishi Sunak just today said that the British government was going to increase its military spending to 2.5% of GDP by the end of this decade, and it would do so because we must put Britain on a war footing. So apparently Britain is now going to be put on a war footing to deal with the enemies of the imperialism that they perceive over the next decade. My view is that we do need the collective will, but the collective will can only come from the organizations of working people who have no interest in going to war against each other and nations around the world. Their only interest is coming together in order to bring about peace and to develop the world's economy in the interests of the social needs of humanity in all the areas which are so deficient now in terms of the poverty of the vast majority, 4 billion people still in poverty, the huge inequalities that exist between the rich and the poor, the real danger that we're going to have such global warming over the next decade that we will face serious problems for millions of people in the areas where they live now becoming uninhabitable. These issues, plus the need to sustain and keep world peace against the dangerous moves being made by the imperialist powers and the reaction that could bring, relies upon us as working people to come together to organize to do that. Working people are willing to fight, willing to protest about what is going on in Gaza. They're willing to demand an end to wars everywhere. And I think that's where we have to rely on the agency of change, not to expect the BRICS and their governments to do anything that will bring about peace. They don't have the power anyway, but to rely upon working people to do that. And that seems to be the message we must bring when we're looking at the geopolitical shocks ahead of us.